Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I think we will make a start slowly. I can see some participants trickling in still. So good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending where you are on the planet. Welcome to this semester's first CJS Research Webinar. And in this first webinar, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Naosuke Mukoyama. And Dr. Mukoyama is joining us from Tokyo, where it's evening. So thank you again for making time for this evening talk. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sherzad Muminov. I'm associate professor in Japanese history at the School of History at the University of East Anglia. And this academic year, I am also acting director of the Center for Japanese Studies. I have convened this seminar series for a few years now, and it's always a great pleasure to have scholars from around the world who work on different aspects of Japanese studies to share their research with us, with our scholarly community, and now, thanks to the technology, with people around the world. I will start with a brief introduction of Dr. Mukoyama, after which I will pass the microphone to him to present his talk. Dr. Mukoyama is an associate professor of security studies at the Institute for Future Initiatives of the University of Tokyo. His research interests include sovereignty and state formation, resource politics, and historical international relations. He recently submitted his first book manuscript on the impact of natural resources on the making of states, and he has started a new project on territorial sovereignty in early modern Japan. Some of that research, I believe, we will hear today. Before joining the University of Tokyo, and in fact, when I first contacted him, Dr. Mukoyama was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies of the University of Cambridge. So without further ado, let me pass the mic to Naosuke, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shoza, for the introduction and for inviting me to this seminar series. It's a great honor, although it's a shame that I can't be there physically today. I was in the UK until actually a month ago, because as Shoza introduced, I was a postdoc at Cambridge before starting my current job at the University of Tokyo. And I already miss the UK, although my friends are telling me now that winter has started, which I do not miss. I miss everything except the weather and the food, maybe. But what I miss the most is the lively academic community in the UK. So this is a great opportunity to stay connected with the British academia. So thank you so much for the invitation. So before starting my presentation, let me just give you a little bit of background information about the project. I'm presenting this work to a new audience today because I'm not exactly a Japan specialist, at least yet. I'm an international relations scholar, and my previous work was on the politics of natural resources, or more specifically, the relationship between oil and state formation in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So it wasn't about Japan. So the current project I'm presenting today is related to my previous work in the state formation side, not in terms of the case study. So what I do in this project is that I use the Japanese case for feedback on international relations theory, rather than finding new historical facts about early modern Japan. But I offer an interpretation of the Japanese case from an international relations viewpoint. And most of the things I'll present today is part of the paper that I have recently got accepted at European Journal of International Relations. And I will also briefly talk about how I plan to develop this project into a bigger book project as well. So this sort of began with an issue with an existing international relations theory, the issue of Eurocentrism. So it has been said that the traditional conventional IR theory depends too much on European cases. So if you look at any international relations theory, pretty much any theory, any theory is based on European experiences only. So they're not really any theory that is based on non-European cases. And non-European polities have been given very little acknowledgement of agency. And there has been an assumption that those theories based on European cases can be automatically applied to non-European cases. But with the rise of new sort of trend in non-Western international relations, there has been some change. Non-Western IR criticizes Eurocentrism and it tries to shift the balance in favor of non-Western international systems. So what they basically say is that European cases and non-European cases are so different that existing theories that are based on European experiences cannot be directly applied to non-European cases. And naturally, this tradition, non-Western IR, tends to emphasize differences between European cases and non-European cases. But today, my project is going to talk about the similarities between the two systems. And I address the issue of Eurocentrism from a different viewpoint. So the issue of Eurocentrism can be seen in this example of the history of sovereign states, for example. This is a graph of the number of sovereign states over time, and this is based on this conventional data set called correlates of war, which every international relations scholar has used. And this graph kind of tells you that the number of sovereign states increased over time steadily. But if you use a newer data set, it looks quite different. The graph has a U shape or V shape. So the number of sovereign states used to be high, around 125, 130, but it decreased and then increased again after the Second World War. But if you compare those two maps, the graph after 1920, around 1920, is basically the same across the two graphs, but the period before that is quite different. And the reason why it's different is that these two data sets use different definitions of a sovereign state. And this one, the conventional one, requires a polity to be recognized by Britain or France to qualify as a sovereign state. So unless you are recognized by either of the two countries, you're not a sovereign state in this data set. In pre-colonial Africa or pre-colonial Southeast Asia, even if those countries have some sort of institutions and could qualify as a state, unless they are recognized by some European countries, they are not a state. So you can see how strong Eurocentric bias was in international relations. And this is obviously the case for, as I said, in the study of the history of sovereign states. And the conventional understanding in this field was that modern territorial sovereignty, which is basically the system in which we live in, originated in Europe, whose symbol is Westphalia 1648, and expanded to the rest of the world through colonialism. And non-Western IR, on the other hand, tends to emphasize that there used to be diverse international orders persisting in the non-West. But it doesn't necessarily, refute the idea that modern territorial sovereignty originated in Europe. So they both assumed that Europe and other regions were quite different from each other, and Europe was unique in the development of territorial sovereignty. But my project sort of casts some doubt on it and question whether they were actually that different. And in doing that, I focus on a specific aspect of modern territorial sovereignty, which is territory. Territory is an essential component of a sovereign state, as Weber defines the sovereign state as a human community that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So you need to have a territory in order to qualify as a sovereign state. And this specific aspect of territorial sovereignty is also thought to have emerged in Europe first and then other regions later. And although recent studies have found that some elements of territory, like territoriality or sort of territorial rule, the concept of territory, was not necessarily unique to Europe, but they still think that other elements of territory that are linear borders and exclusive rule were unique to Europe. That's the assumption. And existing Northwestern IL doesn't really have any objection to that. But I do have an objection to that. I think I question whether it was really true or not. So, as I said, territorial sovereignty includes different elements, and territory is only one of them. And within territory, there are different elements of territory, and linear borders and exclusive rule are among those elements of territory. So I've specifically focused on the development of linear borders and exclusive rule in early modern Japan. But in a bigger project, I'm planning to look at other elements of components of territorial sovereignty other than territory. And I'll talk about that later in the presentation. So what exactly happened when the linear borders emerged? So what they say in the study of European formation of linear borders is that there used to be frontiers that were zonal. It means that the frontiers were sort of areas in which the territory of two states overlapped. So it was an area rather than a line, but these frontiers sort of narrowed down into a single line that are boundaries in order for a clarity in like, who controls this area and who controls that area. And this shift from frontiers to boundaries was accompanied by some socio-economic changes as well. For example, the frontiers used to be quite permeable. One can just cross the borders without being checked. But after demarcating boundaries, the government started to police the borders as well. They made sure that no one just crosses the border without being checked. And another change was that the taxes used to be levied on people rather than lands. But after conducting cadastral surveys, the authorities started to tax the lands rather than people. And another change was that there used to be shared lands, common lands, or usufruct rights. But these things started to disappear in the early modern period. And lastly, the authorities were not initially, previously interested in demarcating boundaries particularly, but over time, they started to demarcate the borders with boundary stones, boundary mounds, and after having territorial disputes. So I'm trying to say that these changes, the shift from frontiers to boundaries and also the socio-economic or political changes didn't just happen in Europe, but also something similar happened in early modern Japan as well. So by showing that, I demonstrate that the European territorial sovereignty was actually not unique to Europe. So my argument is that exclusive rule over territory demarcated by linear borders was not unique to Europe, and Japan was already well into the process of building a similar territorial order during the early modern period. We don't really think it's necessary to explain the case selection, in front of a Japanese studies audience, but the reason why I chose Japan for my case study is first because East Asia has been the central focus of non-Western IR, so it's relatively easy to sort of engage with the existing literature. And the second reason is that although, Sakoku was not exactly the reality, but it's still true that there was some sort of restriction of interactions with foreign states for centuries. So it's kind of like relatively easy to identify what was sort of an organic development in Japan and what was a foreign influence. And in terms of the chronological overlap, there was an overlap between the European and Japanese early modern period. So you can, it's relatively easy to, say that these were parallel developments, not, one affecting the other. Lastly, the last reason I chose Japan as a case is that there was a same basic political structure throughout the Edo period. Because there wasn't fundamental political change during the Edo period, you can rule out the possibility that some changes in territory linear borders were caused by a fundamental shift in the political structure. So those are the reasons why I focus on Japan in this project. So another important caveat I have to make is that I see Japan not as a unitary state, but as sort of an international system. This is because the central government, especially the shogunate, Tokugawa shogunate, controlled only a small portion of lands within Japan. As you can see in this map created by Fabian Drixler, the lands colored in yellow were controlled by the shogunate, and the rest of Japan was controlled by dozens of domanial lords. So according to Japanese historians, early modern Japan was a multiplicity of states within the state, or more federal than centralized in form. So, and there were quite a few relatively autonomous daimyo, especially in peripheral regions such as Tohoku or Kyushu. So I admit that, there was the central authority, but still there was a significant level of autonomy within early modern Japan. So I see Japan as a hierarchical international system. Quite some sort of, you can see some sort of similarity with the Holy Roman Empire, for example. So how did those linear borders emerge in early modern Japan? I see the origins of linear borders in Japan in the Sengoku period. There is this famous theory by Charles Tilly about war making and state making. Basically, in order to wage a war, you need to mobilize the financial resources and also the people. And through this mobilization process, the government institutions are developed, and eventually the state formation can proceed, progress significantly during the war. So, and something similar actually happened during the Sengoku period, in my opinion. There were state building efforts. The Sengoku warlords started to tax the lands and people, and they conducted land surveys, and they developed standing armies. And they were quite interested in boundary demarcation as well, because after battles, after a war, they needed to make sure where their territory ended and started. And according to Barton, these Sengoku linear borders were quite well defined. But the problem with Sengoku period was that it was a period of constant warfare, constant struggle. So borders could still change after another war. So there was not much incentive to perpetuate the borders during the Sengoku period. And this Sengoku period obviously ended with unification attempts by Oda, Toyotomi, and Tokugawa, and with unification attempts partially successful. There were varying degrees of central control and also varying degrees of state formation in domains. So if you look at central areas such as Kinai and Kanto, you can see some strong control of the shogunate of those territories. And in these areas, there wasn't much further development of linear borders that started in the Sengoku period after the unification attempts in individual domains. But on the other hand, in peripheral regions such as Kyushu and Tohoku, you can see some persistence of practically sovereign kunimochi daimyo. And in these domains, boundary demarcation process actually continued even during the Edo period. So what exactly happened in the early modern period? There was a surge of boundary disputes in the 17th century between different domains. And these contested borders were more likely to be linearly defined because they need to, agree on the borders, the exact location of borders to prevent any further conflict in the future. So here's an example. There was this conflict between Hachinohe and Morioka domains that started in 1669. It was a conflict over the use of a river. It started as a conflict between villages, but it developed into a conflict between domains eventually. In this case, these domains were quite lucky in the sense that they could reach an agreement through negotiations. And after negotiation, maybe because Hachinohe used to be part of Morioka domain, so they are quite close to each other. And after negotiations, they reached an agreement, and as a result, they exchanged boundary maps with each other, so that they make sure that these are the locations of the boundaries between them. And as you can see in this map, the borders are clearly defined, and each black dot in this map is a boundary mound built along the borders. So they built dozens of boundary mounds to demarcate the borders clearly. And another example is a conflict between Okayama domain and Naoshima shogunate territory that started in 1680s about an island on Seto Naikai called Ishima Island. And it was a conflict over fishing rights near the island, and also the right to pick up some plants on the Ishima Island. And unfortunately, quite different from the previous example, they couldn't reach a solution through negotiations. So they had to submit the conflict to Hyojosho, which was the central court of the shogunate. And Hyojosho made a ruling first in favor of Naoshima and then later in favor of Okayama. So after they reached an agreement, they again exchanged boundary maps, and one of which is shown here. And as you can see in the map, the borders were clearly defined on the map. And what's interesting about this case is that this border now constitutes a prefectural border between Okayama and Kagawa prefectures. So you can see how clearly defined these borders were, and how it persisted even into the modern period. So what happened during the early modern period was sort of an institutionalization of borders. There was, increasing economic activity during the early modern period that sort of led to border demarcation. For example, sea or river used to function as natural borders or natural buffer zone. So you didn't really have to demarcate the exact location of borders, because, if you look at the river, you can see the end of your territory. But as people started to use sea or river for transport and fishing and other things, they started to feel the need of exactly knowing where your territory begins and ends. So they started to, draw a line on the river or in the sea. Similarly, the gold mines or silver mines were economically important, and they became a source of boundary disputes as well. And another example is a decline of iriaichi, shared lands or common lands. Villages used to share some lands with each other, but in need of more clarity in their property rights, they started to decide which village it belongs to, and the number of iriaichi declined over time in the early modern period. So what happened during this period is sort of, you can see borders as international institutions that, which are, according to Simmons, which help to secure property rights, signal much greater jurisdictional and policy certainty, and reduce the transaction costs associated with international economic transactions. So, in the early modern period, in the Edo period, there was no further military conquests. So the domains had the incentive to perpetuate the borders for stability and some economic gains. So you can see some differences between Sengoku borders and Edo borders. During the Sengoku period, the constant militarized conflicts sort of caused a boundary demarcation because, in order to prevent further conflict, militarized conflict, you need to decide on the location of borders. But the problem was further conquest was still possible. So you didn't, the borders could change again next year. So there was no strong incentive to perpetuate the borders. On the other hand, during the Edo period, there was no forceful change of borders anymore, at least in principle. And because of that, the domains had a strong incentive to perpetuate the borders for institutional stability and economic benefits as well. So what did those boundaries look like on the ground? So here are some photos of boundary markers that still remain today. The left one is a collection of boundary stones between Yanagawa and Kurume domains. And you can see a clear line formed by these boundary stones. And the right picture is boundary mounds between Hirosaki and Morioka domains. And you can see two big mounds and two small mounds that demarcate a line between the two domains. They are quite, rare cases of boundary markers still remaining today. Many of them just, disappeared over time. But you can see clearly that boundaries were, linearly defined and clearly defined in the Edo period. And they didn't just, demarcate the borders, but they actually exerted exclusive rule within the borders. So they, for example, built guard houses and stationed soldiers at those guard houses, and they made sure that no one just, crosses the borders. So they policed the borders, and also, towards the end of the Edo period, domains started to, issue their own currency, and they had different legal systems, and usually intermarriages are prohibited across domains. So you can see some evidence of exclusive rule within each territory of domains. And one interesting example of such exclusive rule is Oniyanagi and Aisari villages in present-day Iwate prefecture. And these are two villages, but they are topographically and geographically continuous and contiguous with each other. So if you look at those villages from the sky, they look like one village, but they were separated by domanial boundaries between Morioka and Sendai domains. So they look like one village, but they are divided into two villages. And during the early modern period, the two domains policed the borders with guard houses and soldiers, and there was very limited interactions between the two domains, the two villages. However, in the modern period, they were integrated into the same city, Kitakami City. So they were no longer, those domanial borders didn't mean anything anymore, on paper at least. But what's interesting is that the division between these two villages persisted into the modern period, and even today, despite being part of the same prefecture, the same city. So the evidence of that is they still have separate communities. They have different no-kyo agricultural cooperative. They have different youth communities, although I'm not sure if they have that many youth in these villages anymore. But they do certainly have a lot of elderly people, so they have different elderly communities as well, and they have different separate fire brigades. They hold festivals separately, even though they are in the same city. So this is an interesting case of exclusive rule that started in the Edo period, still persisting into the modern period. So you can see how exclusive rule was strong in this period. And another factor that contributed to the demarcation of boundaries was cartography. I'm talking about this cartography because there is this famous work on the relationship between cartography and state formation in early modern Europe. And I'm trying to say that there's something similar also happened in early modern Japan. So map making led to border making. And a good example of that is Kuniezu projects by the shogunate. So the shogunate ordered each domain to submit a map of its territory, and the domains next to each other had to agree on their boundaries, which naturally led to boundary disputes between the domains, and that resulted in increasing boundary demarcation between these domains, especially after the Genroku version of Kuniezu, because that required more precision about the borders. So to summarize, linear borders, and I think I've shown that linear borders and mutual exclusion were not unique to Europe. And Japan was already well into the process of building a similar territorial order during the early modern period. And I think this paper contributes to both international relations and Japanese studies literatures. First, it tackles the issue of what's called Westphalian myth, which is the idea that the sovereign state system was established in Westphalia in 1648. The usual criticism of this is from a temporal viewpoint that says that the establishment of sovereign state system occurred much later. The process continued until the 19th century, so Westphalia 1648 didn't mean much in the development. But my criticism is a geographical one, in the sense that I show that the changes associated with Westphalia didn't just happen in Europe, but also in other regional contexts, at least in Japan. And second, I think I present an alternative way of addressing Eurocentrism. The conventional non-Western IR looks at Eurocentrism by emphasizing differences between European and non-European systems. But instead, I emphasize the similarities between the two to say that European system was not that unique in the development of territorial sovereignty. And in terms of the contribution to Japanese studies, I don't show this, but I suggest that there might have been continuity between early modern and modern Japan rather than discontinuity. What I mean by that is that Japan's quick adaptation to the Western sovereign state system is usually attributed to the changes after the Meiji Restoration. But what this project suggests is that there might have been some continuity between the two. Japan might have been already sort of familiar with the European sovereign state system, with territorial sovereignty, and that facilitated the adaptation process after the Meiji Restoration. And there are some potential counter arguments to this kind of argument. For one is, one might think that early modern Japan was still affected by the West, and maybe what the changes I described were caused by the interactions with the West. But there was still limited interaction with the Western people, and I can't find any evidence that Europeans created linear borders, drew linear borders in Japan. And also in the 17th century, when these changes happened in Japan, Europe was also still at the beginning of this process. So you can't really say that Europe affected the boundary formation in Japan. And one might also say that, you know, these domanial borders were internal borders, not external borders. So you can't really think of them as borders. But, you know, no one really thinks of Japan, early modern Japan, as a sovereign state. And if Japan was not a sovereign state, then you can't really say that, you know, you can't really distinguish internal borders from external borders. So I think domanial borders still could count as borders. And you know, another potential counterargument is that this is not a perfect example of linear borders and mutual exclusion, which is true, but neither was Europe in the same period. So, you know, much of conventional international relations has compared ideal type Europe with you know, real case in outside of Europe. So I think we should you know, stop doing that and look at the actual cases of both in Europe and outside of Europe. So how do I plan to develop this project into a bigger book project? As I said, territorial sovereignty is a bundle of different components, different institutions, and territory is just one of them. So there are other aspects of territorial sovereignty, such as the concept of sovereignty itself, or government, or nation. So I'm planning to look at those other aspects of territorial sovereignty in order to develop this into a bigger project. So, for example, you know, the concept of sovereignty, there are concepts like kuni or koka, and I want to see how similar or dissimilar to these terms were to sovereignty. And in terms of the government, I'm wondering if how strong the state capacity of each domain was, whether there was monopoly of violence. And in terms of the nation, I want to see whether there was the development of national identity in domains rather than the entire Japan. So I'm planning to try to answer these questions in the coming years to develop this into a book project. And I also encounter some other topics that could potentially be interesting to look at. One is it seems that there was some sort of politics of territory between the shogunate, domains, and villages in the early modern period. So the shogunate, when the shogunate ordered the creation of kuniezu maps, the shogunate wanted to make the units of basic units of this map to be provinces rather than domains. So it wanted to sort of portray Japan as a unitary state controlled by the central government, which is the shogunate. And the administration was sort of conducted according to provinces controlled by the central government rather than domains. But domains obviously didn't like this spatial imaginary, so they had another conception of Japan divided into domains. And villages, on the other hand, or ordinary people, sometimes didn't like being controlled by the state because, you know, a new cadastral survey could increase the taxes. So ordinary people often resisted the attempts of the authorities to sort of control their lands. And another topic I'm interested in is the relationship between peacemaking and state making. As I introduced, there is this theory about war making and state making, but in the case of early modern Japan, it was actually in the period of international peace that state formation progressed. So I'm suspecting that there might be something about international peace and state making. And the third topic I'm interested in is the state formation in the periphery. So as I said, the boundary demarcation process was most advanced in peripheral regions where strong kunimochi daimyo were controlling the territory. So I'm suspecting there might be something about periphery and state formation. So I'm planning to look at those other topics in the bigger project as well. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to getting your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Naosuke, for a fascinating talk. this talk is particularly interesting to me because I'm a historian and I'm also a historian of Japan, but I believe it will also be interesting to scholars and students of other disciplines, specifically political science, international relations. So it was very enlightening for me. And we have had some questions. So in the question and answer section, I will now read them in the order in which they came. But I would also like to encourage other participants while our speaker answers these first questions. Please feel free to type in new questions. We have some time for Q&A, so your questions or comments are most welcome. So our first question is from Dr. Paul Kreitman. Thanks for a fascinating presentation, and I look forward to hearing how the project develops. I have two questions. So the first question: one key feature of territoriality, as far as I understand, is that jurisdiction over territory trumps jurisdiction over people. But Howell and others argue that the logic of the container society or status system was fundamental to the Tokugawa polity right up until 1868. Do you see examples to counter that? So that's the first question. So Naosuke, if you've taken notes, I will move on to the second question, ask them both, and then give you some time to answer, if that's okay. Okay, so Paul's second question is, we see plenty examples of Tokugawa attempts to demarcate rights to specific resources, for example, iriachi, fishing grounds, etc. Were there also cases where boundaries established to demarcate one resource were then used to adjudicate claims to other resources? For example, iriachi boundaries used to adjudicate claims to newly discovered silver mines. And Paul says he has more questions. So if we have time, Paul, feel free to ask more questions. I will let Naosuke answer these two questions now.
Yes, thanks so much for the questions, Paul. I'm not exactly sure I have great answers to those questions, but they are very important questions. The first one about the container side, or the issue of control over territory or people. I think they were both. I think it's sort of a mixed system. As I said, Japan itself was not exactly a unitary state, but also not exactly a system of perfect sovereign states. So it was a mixed system, and also the control of the domains over people and lands is not a sort of a black and white issue. I think the evidence that domains were interested in locating the exact location of the borders means that they were interested in territorial control, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were only interested in territorial control. So they were interested in controlling people. They needed to know who lives in which area and who controls these lands and stuff. So I think I'm not going to counter the idea that there was jurisdiction over people. I'm trying to say that the idea that there was no such thing as territory or territorial control, linear borders, these things, that which is the assumption that international relations theory has traditionally had, is not sustainable. It is not supported by evidence in early modern Japan. So yeah, the short answer is I think there was both control over territory and people. And as for the second question, I'm sorry, but I don't have the exact example of such cases. But yeah, the market one. Yeah, I think I'm not sure exactly if this is a case of that kind, but the case I just used in my presentation, the issue of control of Ishima Island between Okayama and Naoshima. I mean, it started with as a issue of fishing rights, and then it was also an issue of picking up plants on the island. So the fishing rights was about the sea near the island, but it could serve, these territorial disputes could serve multiple functions, I think, but I'm not exactly sure about the cases, like Iriaichi boundaries used to, as you pointed out, to Iriaichi boundaries and civil mines. I don't really have the examples yet. I'll look into that. Thank you for the questions, though. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is from Dr. Ram Mason. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I wondered, to what extent is the early modern Japanese experience really missing from existing literature? In other words, isn't the establishment of these kinds of mini-states within the body of present-day Japan well established? In any case, it's an interesting observation, but what, if anything, do you think are the most significant implications of your study?
Right. Thank you so much for the comment. Yes. In my view, this point about Japan being a multiplicity of states within the state is kind of well established in among Japanese historians. So I'm not trying to make a new point in terms of the study of history of the early modern Japan itself. But what I'm trying to do, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, what I'm trying to say here is I use this Japanese example to sort of counter-argue the existing assumptions of international relations theory, which assumes, surprisingly, that there was no such thing as territorial control territory, linear borders outside of Europe until the modern period. So yeah, I think your point is valid. I'm not adding much to the study of the history of early modern period, but what I'm doing is to, using that established knowledge, I'm trying to give feedback to the international relations theory. Yeah, thank you for the question.
So the next question is from Travis Seifman. Or two questions. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I look forward to reading more of what you find as the project progresses. I think you have already touched upon acknowledging first the complexity of the shogunate domain system as a system of states within a state, the quasi-autonomy of the domains under Tokugawa authority, and two, those exceptional cases in areas of Japan that represent exceptions. Nevertheless, I wonder if you could speak just a bit more on, again, first is how the quasi-autonomy or quasi-sovereignty of the daimyo fits into your thinking. In what ways were the daimyo sovereigns and their domains akin to sovereign states, and in what ways were they not, and how does that affect your overall conclusions? That's the first part of the question. And the second is how exceptional cases such as Tsushima, Ryukyu, and Matsumae fit into your thinking.
Thank you so much for the fascinating questions again. Yeah, regarding the first question, yeah, so I see, as I said, I see Japan as sort of a hierarchical international system. So the domains were not exactly, perfect sovereigns, but they had, to varying degrees, they had some sort of autonomy and, quasi-sovereignty. Yeah, in what ways they were not? So there was, in order to be completely sovereign, there cannot be any higher authority. So the presence of, the presence of the shogunate and the emperor, for that matter, sort of prevents domains from qualifying as complete sovereigns. But at the same time, the shogunate didn't, tax the people in individual domains. or they didn't, exert direct control of the territories within domains in the lands they are not controlling. So in terms of those things, and also the domains maintained their own, physical force, violence. So in terms of these things, the domains were quite similar to the sovereign states. So, and my conclusion is because the assumption in international relations is so strong, I don't have to show that Japanese domains were complete sovereigns to make my point in my understanding, because they think that the international relations theory assumes that there was no such thing as linear borders in Japan. I just want to say that it was at least a mixed system, and there was something, although limited, some sort of development of linear borders in early modern Japan. I think this is enough at least to counter-argue this assumption, but I get that I need more clarity in how to what extent exactly Japanese domains were sovereign or not. And in order to do that, I think I also need to look at the other aspects that I talked about in the end of the presentation, such as the concept of sovereignty, or the control of the government of the lands and people, or the development of nation and such things. So yeah, I think this is sort of my homework for the future project. And the second question, unfortunately, I didn't really look much into into Tsushima, Ryukyu, or Matsumae in my work, partly because these areas are often studied in the study, I think, in research on the boundaries between Japan and other states, Japan and Korea, Japan and China, Japan and Russia. But I was primarily interested in the boundaries between domains within what we think of Japan at that time. So I didn't do enough research on these cases at this point, but your comment, your question sort of made me think about those cases. So I will probably look into that when I develop this into a book project. Thank you so much.
Okay, there are some follow-ups, but I will ask the questions, and if we have time, I will then read the follow-ups from Paul and Travis. So our next question is from Ziyi Xiakang. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. As a historian, I find the idea of boundary a bit confusing. Boundaries also existed within a domain, such as between two villages or between land owned by two families. It seems a lot of your points would also apply to these internal boundaries. So what is the significance of state or sovereignty in the discussion?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Thank you so much. It's kind of to be honest, I'm still a bit confused myself as well. So in the study of European state formation, I think it's still quite unclear about what exactly they mean by boundaries, and the boundaries between villages or lands. They do sort of I think the way to distinguish that is, as you pointed out, the idea of state or sovereignty. So what they give a special meaning to borders between sovereign states, because there wasn't such thing before the development of linear borders sovereignty in the early modern period. So they do think that borders between sovereign states are quite different conceptually from borders between villages. I'm not sure how borders between villages were demarcated in early modern Japan, but all these boundary disputes in the early modern period started as the issue of boundary demarcation between villages, and they started to, develop into boundary dispute between domains. So they are, intertwined with each other. But yeah, so in this, the reason why I sort of discussed how I see Japan as an international system is that I still, because the literature puts a weight on an importance on the sovereignty, the borders between sovereign states, I somehow needed to show that Japan can be seen as an international system of sovereign states to some extent. That's why I need to discuss the sovereignty issue here. And you touched up on the key issue about the distinction between villages and then domains and sovereign states. So I don't have the clear answer, I'm sorry, but yeah, this is I need to develop the concept of sovereignty, understanding of sovereignty a bit further in the project. Thank you for the comment.
Now to follow-up questions from Paul and Travis. So Paul writes, thank you very much for your answer. I have to go now, but I suppose as a hypothetical example, David Howell would say that if two vassals of Tosa got in a fight in the street in Tokushima, then it would be the Tosa daimyo who would adjudicate the dispute. But under a territorial system, it would be the Tokushima daimyo who would adjudicate. That seems to be a fundamental difference. That's the question.
Yeah, I think that it is. Yeah, that's a great example actually. And yeah, I mean, an interesting example is, when a criminal escapes from one domain to another, the police from the original domain cannot enter the other domain freely, and so it's about territorial control rather than control over people in this instance. And if peasants, farmers escape from one domain to another, the two domains had to negotiate to arrange the return of those peasants. So this is another example of territorial control rather than control over people. So yeah, I mean, there are, as you pointed out, I think there are quite a few examples of territorial rule rather than rule over people. And yeah, although there was a mix of the two, I think there certainly was control over territory. Thank you for the point.
Thank you. And Travis's follow-up is, thanks so much for taking the time to address my questions. I think the Tokugawa case, as you were addressing it, presents a really interesting and good contribution to complicating or challenging Eurocentric notions. I hope this work is received well within IR poli-sci circles. So that was a comment.
Thank you.
And follow-up from our colleague, Dr. Ram Mason. As someone working within IR, I hear a lot of comparable critiques to yours, although I find your example very persuasive. However, is there a sense in which IR theory actually does not remove the existence of other approaches, rather that the European one is important? So how would you respond to this?
Is there a sense in which IR theory does not remove the existence? Not sure if I understand the question correctly, but yeah.
I guess the main question is there a sense in which IR theory does not remove the existence of other approaches?
Okay, I don't know if I understand correctly, but I try to say something about the approaches in IR. So I think there is sort of like increasing awareness in the IR field that Eurocentrism it shouldn't be just left untouched. We need to address the issue of Eurocentrism, and I think it's just IL has not like consciously ignored other approaches, but they because there wasn't much diversity among the IL scholars in the first place, traditionally, they tended to focus on European cases because they are most familiar with those cases. But these days, there are quite a few scholars from different regions, and they want to sort of contribute to the discussion by looking at other cases. And East Asia has been among the most active in that sense, because there's quite a few scholars from East Asia who look at East Asian cases to give feedback to the IL theory. And yeah, so there has been the assumption that European cases are somewhat unique and special for that matter. But that perception is starting to change, at least in, I don't know, British and European IL academia. Yeah, I'm not sure this is a good answer to the original question, but I think that's my response-ish.
Thank you. Initially, when I reached out to you to invite you to this seminar, I was hoping that we could invite you on a short train trip from Cambridge, and
yeah.
in that situation, we would be able to ask these questions also in person.
Mm-hmm.
So if I may ask the final question, we have about 10 minutes. You've received already quite a few good questions, and as it's quite late in Tokyo, I hope you're not too tired. I find this topic very fascinating. And my question is about Meiji period. So as a modernist, I'm interested in the ways in which Japanese leadership, the Meiji leadership specifically, which had built obviously its sovereignty and its practices of demarcating borders and all the other practices within the state, which had of course built it on the Edo period. So when, as you very well know, the Meiji state started to modernize, if we use that word, and when they started to internalize some of the practices that were European initially, but then became, components or features of any modern nation state as we know it. So what happened to these old practices that you are claiming were not much different, or were not much, were comparable to the European ones? What did the Meiji leadership completely dismiss everything that was already in existence in Japan? Did they continue keeping them, as well as bringing in new practices that they have imitated or that they have learned from the European practice? So I'm very curious about the fate of these boundary making practices or demarcating practices, because if they were not much different, then there wouldn't be any need to introduce anything European, would there? So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question that's difficult to answer. So first of all, I need to say that I'm not a specialist in the Meiji period, so my knowledge is quite limited. But having said that, I think, well, my understanding, I don't have evidence yet, but my understanding is that these old practices that because they were quite similar to what Europeans invented in the early modern period, I think it's persisted. It still survived in the conception, the spatial understanding, the spatial imaginary, the geographical conception among the Meiji leadership as well. It might not be the exact technologies. So, for example, the map-making technologies were much developed after the introduction of European specific technologies, but the understanding of space and demarcating boundaries, sort of controlling over territory, that sort of like ideas imaginary concepts, these, I think, still lived within the Meiji leadership even after the Meiji Restoration. So I think it's not the exact technologies. I think when you talk about map making, for example, a lot of criticism comes from the fact that Japan did not, the Japanese maps didn't use the altitudes and some technologies that European counterparts used. But I don't think that's the main main issue when it comes to territorial control, territorial understanding. I think the softer side of the territorial understanding was still there, and it's sort of continued into the Meiji period. And even in the cases that I introduced in the presentation, the borders that were formed during the Edo period persisted into the Meiji period. So the borders between Kagawa and Okayama domains on Nishima Island, the borders were first established in the Edo period, and these borders still form the border between the two prefectures today. So it's not like after the Meiji Restoration, the previous old practices just disappeared and the new ones were introduced. I think there was also some continuity in the practices as well. But at least what I can say is, I think that at least in the concept and understanding of territory, I think there was continuity even into the Meiji period. And because they were similar to the new technology, new conceptions of territory, I think they kind of naturally merged with the new ones, and so that the new ones look like actually new, but they might be something tacitly inherited from the Edo period. Yeah, that's my current response. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As I said, this is a fascinating topic. I learned a lot myself, and I hope the same can be said about our attendees. I would like to thank everyone who joined us today and thank everyone who asked questions. I would like to make one announcement before we leave about the future CJS research seminars and webinars. So this semester we have 4 more events coming up. The next event, which will be exactly 2 weeks from today, on the 27th of October, at the same time of 1 p.m. British summertime, we will still be in British summertime at that time, and 9 p.m. Japanese time, we have Dr. Andras Bartok from the University of Public Service in Hungary, who will talk on Asia-Pacific tensions, Japan, China, and Taiwan, flashpoint, military capabilities, deterrence, ways to conceptualize and measure them. So this is a topic that is very important, obviously, in any time, but especially these days when in East Asia, the issues of the relations, international relations between Japan, China, Taiwan, once again become, we see that quite often in the headlines. So I'm sure this talk will be very interesting. Naosuke, I hope you can also join us if you can, and also maybe invite other people who are interested in this. For those of you who are in Norwich and will be on campus, plan to be on campus on the 27th, this event will also be in person. So it will be a hybrid event. We will be having a meeting in a room at the university on campus. There will be sake and some light refreshments. So please feel free to join us. And there will be 3 more events until Christmas, which will be announced in due course. We have the whole program which has been circulated through our social media accounts. So I think all that remains right now for me is to thank, on behalf of Center for Japanese Studies and on behalf of all our attendees, our speaker today, Dr. Naosuke Mukoyama from the University of Tokyo, for a fascinating talk and for your answers to the questions. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the best for the future. And I hope your book and your research is well received. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the end of this seminar. Thank you all for joining.